a self-deprecating thing, you know, like saying, well, you can't hang shit on us because we're hanging it on ourselves, kind of thing. And that, you know, Wombi contributed a lot of humour and fun to the band in that way.
Right, he did. Yeah.
In fact, cuttingly so.
Shame,
Sometimes.
shame he wasn't here today.
It is a shame Wombi's not here, but he's alive, so maybe next time.
Okay, I'll just pause there. Well, let's start. Let's go right back to the beginning. What was that? It's a really loud hum.
Yep, that's the fridge.
Okay. Let's start at the beginning. I know we've covered it a little bit, but Dave, perhaps you could start by telling me how the Unknown Blues got started, just briefly with yourself and Barry and Phil.
Okay. Unknown Blues kicked off probably end of 65, beginning of 66. My neighbour, Phil Sharman, he lived a few doors down, and I had decided we'd form a band, and you know, we didn't really know what we were doing. And I remembered Barry had, from school, played a bit of guitar, and he'd just come back into town. He'd be away or something, and said, "Do you want to join in?" And we'd seen Vaughan playing in the Whom, and realised that, you know, he was no longer in the Whom, and just got together, had my home, and played a few records and mussed around, and Vaughan effectively taught us all how to play, I think. It went like that, and then we didn't have a bass player, so it was a pretty cool looking guy walking around town with the long blonde hair. And
Yes, that was good. Let me just flick to you, Vaughan. Is that correct? What Dave says? Did you? How were these guys? I can hear your shoes. How were these guys musically when you met them, and how did you whip them into shape, if you did?
I remember the first time that we got together was at Rocket's place, and we all sat down, and everybody had guitars and things, and they were chatting about what they wanted to do, and I had come along more or less. I was asked if I could advise them how they could get started as a group, and within about 5 minutes Phil Sharman had taken a really nice red Hofner semi-acoustic out and announced he was going to be the lead guitarist. Within another 5 minutes it was obvious that he couldn't even play a chord, and I had a quick think, and we continued to chat, and I could see Barry was already a pretty accomplished sort of a guitarist, and Dave was fiddling around on the harmonica, and Rocket couldn't play a bass guitar, and I quickly went through the options, and I thought, now I can probably get up to speed with simple lead guitar, and if I can talk this guy out of being a lead guitarist, I can get him to buy my drums and teach him to be a drummer. And he quite liked that idea. And then within a week or two, we had that new sort of setup where Dave was singing harmonica, Barry was rhythm, Rocket was starting on bass, Phil was picking up the drums, not too bad, and I was practicing a few simple blues lead things on guitar, and we started rehearsing probably only half a dozen numbers. And I had a cheap guitar at the time and a very nice Gibson 345 stereo came on the market, which I bought from Wellington, and then we moved into I Street, where we started practicing seriously, probably 3 or 4 nights a week, until we had about a dozen tunes off. And then I think I contacted somebody who I'd done bookings with before, with the band called Whom, and organised a booking for us at Waverley. So that's how it kicked off.
Excellent. I'm just going to pause there. Okay. Dave, can we just start with you again about the very origins? Give us, and talking to me, give me a brief description of the very origins of the Unknown Blues.
The Unknown Blues, to my recall, started with Phil Sharman and I, who were kids in the same street. I didn't know Phil at all. We didn't go to the same school, but we both were the two long hairs in Crawford Street here in Invercargill. Got chatting on the bus one day and both liked the same records. you know, Stones, Pretty Things, all that, whatever, and decided we'd like to form a band. And who's going to be in it? Well, I remembered Barry from school, who played guitar. Barry and I were in the first year of high school together. Just cycle home a bit, go around to Barry's place and listen to old rock and roll records, and Barry played a bit of guitar, so I remembered him. So I got in touch with Barry. He was all keen. And I'd met Vaughan, or not really didn't really know him, but knew him through the Dancers Seeing the Whom, and got in touch with him, and because I think he'd left the Whom, or the Whom was breaking up or something, and yeah, we got talking about it from there. And then Rocket was just a cool looking guy around town who looked like he might fit in. You've got to realise that image was pretty important at the same time, as well as the mutual love of the music we were playing. We wanted to look good too. And Vaughan taught us all how to play. Yeah, we were very inexperienced, and I might turn this over to Vaughan and he can tell us how he whipped us into shape, eh?
But just before we do that, Dave mentioned that he knew you knew how to play guitar. Can you just tell me how you came to learn guitar and how you learned the ukulele from your Polynesian friend who influenced your style?
Yeah, I never really learnt the guitar. I still don't know the names of chords. Some of them I know, but not a lot. But yeah, how I learnt to strum the guitar was from a Samoan fella, Tony. Years ago, I was about 14, and I was around at his place one day, and he just showed me how to strum the ukulele, and that's how I picked up the fast strum. I still use it today. Not many people strum like that. It's just something I've always done. I didn't realise that nobody really played like that.
And so that's quite interesting, isn't it? Because that's sort of a Maori Polynesian style.
Yeah, yeah.
Can you tell me a little bit? Can you basically tell me that? Tell me a little bit about how that, you know, which is unique to New Zealand and this part of the world, how you've incorporated it into your style?
Yeah, well, it's just a fast strum, and save you, you know, going like hell with your hand. You can just use your fingers like that. I don't know too much about it.
Well, I remember Barry playing with you, and I mean, not in later years, playing with other drummers, and you were hugely part of the rhythm section that drove the rhythm of the band. And we didn't know what it was, but it's the way you play. You know, that, you know, it's banging away there with the drums and the bass, and that's a wonderful, you know, bedrock for the whole sound to be built on. But, you know, if you don't know what you're doing, neither do I, but I know it sounds good. Sounds great.
Okay, now Vaughan, just like as we were talking about before, you were the most musically experienced one. Will you tell me about that and how you sort of organised the band, just briefly?
Memories of beginnings of the Unknown Blues are a little bit faded, but my recollection is I can recall Rocket speaking to me on the street one day and inviting me to come along to, I think it was his place, and advise him and the other boys how to start rehearsing. There was no thought that I would be part of the band at that stage, or I didn't think there was, and got along to Rocket's place, and I was introduced to Phil, who I hadn't seen for years. He went to the same school as me but was a few years younger, and he pulled a really nice Hofner semi-acoustic double cutaway electric guitar out of a case and announced that he was the lead guitarist, and Barry strummed away a bit, and I could see, gee, Barry really knows how to play, and Dave played a bit of harmonica, and I thought, gee, that's really interesting too, because he was doing things I'd never seen live done on a harmonica, but I sort of went back to Phil and I thought, he can't even play, how's he going to be a lead guitarist? And meanwhile Rocket was fumbling away in the background with this bass guitar and sort of didn't really know what he was doing either. And during the course of the evening it became very interesting, because I sort of felt myself that I was getting drawn to these guys because the music they were wanting to play was the music that I was enjoying, that I hadn't been able to play in previous bands. So I thought, sort of on the spur of the moment, I said, well look, Phil, maybe could teach you to be a drummer, and I could perhaps play lead guitar and sort of get up to speed with that. And he agreed with it, and he bought my set of Premier drums, and Rocket sort of I went into a lot of extra practice evenings with him, getting scales and things off, and within a week or two we moved down to I Street, and we started really seriously rehearsing about half a dozen tunes, and once we had those off, we enlarged it a little bit until we were ready to take on our first gig, which was at Waverley, and I rang up a guy who had booked other bands I'd been in for the Waverley venue, and managed to get a booking there. At that stage I was playing a Japanese, a fairly cheap sort of a guitar, and coincidentally somebody I'd played with before was up in Wellington and was selling a very nice Gibson Stereo 345, and so I bought that, I think, for £100, and it was flowing down, and I kept that guitar for the rest of my musical career with the Unknown Blues.
Okay. So you moved into the I Street house. Tell me about the I Street house. Who moved in there? What sort of state was it in? And what sort of state was it in after you'd been living there for a while?
It was good.
So start by saying the I Street house, or our practice house, or something like that.
Do you want me to say this?
Yeah,
Well,
go on.
Barry lived there first.
Yeah, I lived there. I moved in 1966, I think it was, wasn't
Something like that.
it? Yeah, I moved down there because I had nowhere else to live. And we used to have to boil the copper to have a wash. And when it rained, we had to move the table around when we were having tea because the water used to come in and land on the table. But it was a brilliant place because it was two houses in one. It was sort of,
It was an old shop, wasn't it?
Yeah.
It was an
originally?
old shop.
yeah, and like there was a room in there that you didn't know was there. It was all black, painted black and everything. There was no lights or nothing. You could go in there and stay there for a weekend and you wouldn't even know what day it was or anything.
In fact, parties used to go for 3 days, was
Yeah.
common. There were mattresses all over the floor, so you could just drop where you wanted to. The only light was a very small red light in one corner on a table, and on the table was a record player and a pile of records, and you sort of pulled them out and held them up to the light to try and read the label and put them on the record player. So they were all scratched.
Yeah.
The living conditions, I moved in there after Barry, but I can remember the house was owned by two brothers, Dave and Roger Garrick.
Yeah.
And Roger was an apprentice butcher, and he used to bring home these magnificent cuts of meat. So we used to have meals of steak with all the veggies, but we didn't have enough plates. There was a pile of Playboy magazines there, so we used to just serve up our meal on a Playboy magazine and throw it into the rubbish after the meal. So it was pretty basic.
But the gear was set up there all the time,
All the
wasn't it?
time,
Like where,
yeah.
in the old part where the
Where
old
the shop was.
shop was,
Yeah.
it was set up there, and that's why we could just walk in any
old
night of the week. And Roger and David Garrick were just brilliant. Barry and I went to school with them. They were more Maris Brothers boys. And they owned the house. They were from a very large family of 12 kids, and their parents had sent them out, well, not sent, they'd gone and done paper rounds, as 10 and 12-year-olds, and they'd saved up enough money to have a deposit on a house. So not many, we were like teenagers, 16 years old or something, and able to share this house with these guys who actually owned their own house at that age or were still paying it off or whatever. Now that's a pretty unique situation, isn't it? Because no one was going to get thrown out of anywhere. And we would practice 6 nights a week, and if anyone complained about it neighbourly,
Just
the guys
tell them,
owned the house and they were loving it, So it was a pretty privileged, unique situation, wasn't it?
And there were lots and lots of parties as well, so the practices would turn into parties, and then there were lots of girls that used to like to come around and visit, and it was quite easy to con them into doing housekeeping. Like, can you clean that room up for us and things like that? So that was an added bonus, wasn't it?
Well, I didn't live there, so I got nothing to do with that, you know. Well, I slept there a
Yeah.
lot, but didn't go home frequently.
Yeah.
But,
Let's talk about a couple of the band members. Let's talk about Phil Sharman, your first drummer. What sort of guy was he? What sort of drummer was he? And what stands out in your minds for each of you about Phil?
well, Phil was a lifelong friend of mine. He, as I said, some part of it, he and I formed the band. Now, he was a good guy, he was a crazy guy, a temperamental guy. He was everything, rolled into one, very complex sort of guy in many ways. English is very, yes. He was a true eccentric Englishman. You know, it was nothing like on a Saturday night for Phil to put on a frock and go down to the pub just because it was a dull night, you know, and see what happened then. But he wasn't quite up to speed. We learnt very rapidly, and maybe we were a bit ruthless, but we weren't getting on with Phil. He wasn't drumming as well as us, and something happened. He was going away for a while on holiday or trade school, and we got Wombi Mason in to play drums, and so we sacked Phil. You know, now the main outcome of that was there was a bit of a ill feeling for a while, but the worst thing of that was I lived in the same street as Phil. Phil and I still hung out, talked to each other. He accepted why these things happened, but his mother stopped speaking to my mother. And that was the toughest thing about it. Like, my mother worked at the local Coles or Woolworths, and Mrs. Sharman had walked in and she stopped speaking to Mum, so that was pretty hurtful. But anyway, Phil ended up hanging out with the band still through various means, and to short circuit it, Phil was our last bass player. Like, Rocket had left the band, then we got another guy in Martin Wood, and then right towards the end of the band, the last few gigs, we got Phil in and he played bass with us. So Phil was at the beginning and the end of the band. And he moved to us. I actually went over to Australia with him, and we remained lifelong friends, and we had our altercations, we had our moments, but we did remain friends until Phil's untimely death. Phil died of cancer a couple of years ago, and I just wish he was here today still, because he would revel in this. He might even put on the frock. That's the Phil bit for me.
What do you remember of Phil, Barry?
I don't really remember much. We used to get round his car a bit. He used to stop. He'd be driving along.
At the lights.
He'd be driving along, he'd stop at the lights and put his feet up.
On the dashboard.
Then he'd strike a match. He used to do that.
And then he'd fart. He made this discovery with gas. It was pretty
driving
crude.
along.
That's what I remember about
Yeah,
it.
you'd be driving along and he'd stop suddenly, put both feet up, get the match out, and ignite a blow-off as it came out.
Well, no, my absolute favourite was when that wonderful fabric called nylon came out. He progressed from that. He would actually pull the jeans down because he'd find he'd get a bigger and better flame. My favourite was one day these brand new lurid nylon underpants actually caught fire. And he's out of the car running around with his jocks on fire because he lit a fart and he stopped doing it after that. So that was Phil. That was just one of the many sides of Phil. He was a crazy, crazy guy.
Well, when we got to motels, he liked to get right down to the underpants and dance around with the towel.
Oh, that was
like a burlesque dancer.
Yeah,
Remember?
he did lots of tricks. He had good party tricks.
What about Rocket? Tell me in a little more detail how you came to recruit Rocket and why, and where he got his clothes from, and how unusual that was for being in Chicago at the time. Maybe you could start this one for me.
Well, I knew Rocket. He used to carry or go around with another very fashionable guy called John Dawson. Both of them wore all this Beatle gear, and their hair was a bit longer than the Beatles, and they'd occasionally say hello to me at dances I was playing at. But he actually recruited me into the Unknown Blues. He called me along for that first meeting, I think. But what I sort of remember, he was always dressed very sharply.
Incredibly.
But once the band got underway, I noticed his style of dress changed quite a bit, and he was wearing these.
I would just have that ring there. Can I just get you start again from once the band got underway?
once the band got underway, I noticed his clothing changed a little bit. He was becoming not the sharp dresser anymore. He was dressing more casually and wearing really fancy jackets that I'd never seen in the shops before. And it turned out he had a half-sister who was about 40, and he used to go through her cupboards and pinch jackets of hers to wear at the gigs. So remember the striped jackets and things?
It wasn't just that, it was her slacks and her shoes, because I used to go around there sometimes because he'd try and find jackets and belts for me to wear. And he would have these like kind of sandally kind of things that were obviously women's sandals, but I mean, we're talking about Phil and frocks and Rocket and his sister's clothes and that. They weren't Boy George. It was a different kind of thing.
They were both very successful with the ladies, you know. And Rocket was, you know, always had a girl on his arm, so there was no hint that.
But it was just that flamboyance, extrovert, show off. Well, it was like part of the Unknown Blues show, how Rocket dressed accordingly, didn't he?
Yeah.
Like he would dress up really. You'd never know what he was going to turn up.
He was a car painter, and I think the fumes might have stuffed his brain. True.
It's true.
But some of the behaviour that he displayed is probably similar to some of the drug addicts now. You know, like he could be on a real high, or he could all of a sudden go off on a low, couldn't he? Like, you guys are all against me, like a paranoia kind of thing.
What Barry could very well have hit on something there, because Rocket stopped working as a car spray painter because it was proved to be very detrimental to his health. I mean, I see him regularly still. I had some drinks with him last weekend, literally, in New South Wales. So, and he was great, and wishing he was going to be here this week, and I wish he was too. Because his sister still lives down the road, he might have put a jacket on of Joe.
Can I just get you to briefly say how you recruited Rocket as because of his dress sense?
Yes.
I know we kind of covered that,
Yeah.
but I just need to make that point through, not because of his musical ability.
We definitely needed a bass player when we were forming the band. We didn't know anyone, and we all sort of, you know, the hair, the fashion of the time and everything, we wanted someone who looked like he was someone in one of those more outrageous British bands. And John Rocket Hancock, walking around in Invercargill, was there. He dressed incredibly well, and we went up for him and said, "Hey, do you want to join our band?" And he said, "I can't play anything." And it was like, "Well, either can we." So he agreed. You know, it was literally that kind of thing. But I didn't know him well. I knew him from going to the dances where the Whom played and various bands played, and Rocket stood out in the crowd because of the length of his hair and how he was dressed, and he was obviously a non-conformist. You know, he stood out in the crowd, didn't he? To look at, he really did. You know.
It seems like you were really a band of non-conformists. Did you guys attract much flack from other people, from police, from parents? I mean, what sort of stuff did you put up with? Were you looking for that?
I don't know if we were looking for trouble from anyone, but we certainly attracted it. But it made you all the more determined to say, well, I'll wear my hair as long as I like. If I want to wear a pink shirt and yellow jeans or whatever, I will. That's my right, that kind of thing. And we were stubborn, weren't we? And we put up with a lot of crap, like Barry lost his job because he wouldn't get a haircut. We went to work at places like when they were building TY Point and that, remember, and you had to put your hair up under these fashionable hats that you wear today. You know, we were hiding no hair. You know, our hair was all piled up underneath because you couldn't get a job because of your hair, but it was just a fashion thing, I suppose. I don't know. I don't know.
How unusual was what you were doing in Invercargill at the time? I mean, I guess Southland, New Zealand in general was fairly conservative in the mid-60s, and Southland probably one of the most conservative regions. Is that correct? What was Invercargill like in the mid-60s socially?
I think that Invercargill really loved the music scene that was happening, sort of 63, 64, 65. All these bands sprung up playing Beatles music and Beach Boys and Hollies and all this kind of stuff. But Dave hit on something that I didn't experience. Is he started going up to Christchurch and visiting clubs like the Stage Door and rubbing shoulders with people that were doing what we would later be doing. So I think that probably influenced him a little bit. Would that be fair, Dave?
Definitely. Like I did an apprenticeship as a compositor for the Southland News and Southland Times, and the only printing school in New Zealand at the time was in Auckland. So for 4 weeks every year, they'd give you a train ticket and you'd go up to Auckland, and I was seeing bands like the La-Di-Da's and the Underdogs and the Brew and all these great bands that were doing stuff, then stop in Wellington sometimes on the way home and see Barry and the Breakaways and then the Chants at the Stage Door in Christchurch. So you're right, I did see a lot of that stuff live, but it was like I sorted out. You'd go and see who's playing where, and these guys were just doing, I guess that made me realise you could do in New Zealand what I was enjoying on all these English records and that I was listening to, I hadn't heard Muddy Waters or any of those old blues records then, but I loved the bluesy English bands and the bands in all those cities. Hearing other guys in New Zealand doing it made me think, hell, I can do this too,
Probably also to add to that, at about this time I had just been sacked from this band Whom because I was really getting into the Rolling Stones kind of music, and I was in a bit of a limbo where I was thinking, well, I'll probably just give music up and carry on with my life. I had been mucking around a bit on guitar just for my own enjoyment, so if these guys hadn't invited me along to try and help them to put a band together, I had no sort of intentions of hunting to get into another band. So their enthusiasm sort of drew me into it, I think.
Now, just a bit earlier we were talking about Wombi Mason coming into the band. What sort of guy was Wombi? What was he? How good was he as a drummer? What did he bring to the group?
Professionalism.
You can start with saying Wombi or Wombi Mason.
Wombi Mason, who replaced Phil Sharman, brought a certain edge of professionalism along the level that Vaughan had into the band, because he had been literally a professional musician in Invercargill, playing in bands like the Drifters, which in the time of, say, the Shadows, pre-Beatles, were doing all this instrumental stuff, and Wombi was a very accomplished drummer, wasn't he?
Yes,
he was very good.
He had years of experience.
And as soon as he sat down and started playing with us, it lifted the whole game. It was really like the missing thing, and as soon as Wombi joined musically, it locked in. We'd done all that other work, but it did lock in because Barry's great rhythm and Wombi's drums kind of really pushed it along.
How did you experience that, Barry, as a rhythm guitarist? What do you remember of Wombi bringing in, and how did it affect you?
Yeah, I enjoyed Wombi. I think he's a really good drummer, and I liked his sense of humour. I got on well with Wombi, I still do today.
Yeah.
He was good, and he liked the music, and he loved to put on a bit of an act, and no, he was good.
Yeah, he didn't take much adapting at all. In fact, Wombi was at our first gig at that Waverley Bible class dance. I remember him and a very flamboyant hairdresser around town, Kevin Templeton. They were at our gig, and they were standing off to the side of the stage, and they were jumping up and down and screaming and yelling with the rest of them. And I believe they came and introduced themselves to me at the end of the gig, and that's how I met Wombi. And I said, well, I know you from that instrumental band I used to go and see at whatever it was, the Starlight or one of those places, and that I really enjoyed that sort of music pre-hearing all the bluesy bands.
He used to play with...
Let's just pause there. So, Vaughan, what did you want to add about Wombi?
Yeah, with regard to Wombi as a drummer, as opposed to Phil Sharman, what I found, being a drummer myself, was that when we were playing with Phil Sharman, everything was constantly dragging. As you were playing through a number, you'd have to try and get him to lift the tempo all the time. Whereas with Wombi, it was the absolute opposite. He was a real machine, and he kept the tempo right up there, which meant that the band was more exciting to listen to.
Yeah, and there's another thing with Wombi too, like when we're doing those long, extended improvised songs, which we often did, like Smokestack Lightning.
Yes.
And there'd be tempo changes, and often it'd get more exciting.
Yes.
And Wombi would pick up the tempo as the music was soaring. I would often rate it the exact opposite of the slowdown. He'd push it
Yes.
up another
Yes,
notch or
yes,
two.
Yes.
And that really added to the excitement of the live thing,
Yes,
you know, because
yes.
we did a lot of, once we learned how to play and we got freer, we weren't restricted to saying, well, this has got to last for 3 minutes, 52 seconds like the record. There were some tracks we did that could go for 20 minutes. You know, it's really, but they were exciting and people were dancing and going crazy on them. And,
Yes.
but Wombi had a lot to do with that.
Yes, yeah.
We weren't doing that before Wombi came in.
It always felt as if he was just pushing you that little bit more all the time, which in a drummer is a good thing.
Yeah, it's great.
Yeah.
Okay. So, just a little bit more. You guys sound like you were sort of up to speed by that point. You hit your straps as a band. What kind of response were you getting from people who were coming to your shows and from fellow musicians around town?
We were getting a very good response. I can remember when we went up to the Cellar Club, we were in awe of another couple of bands that were playing there, The Pill, who had a Maori lead guitarist who was very accomplished on Hendrix stuff, as well as they were playing a lot of soul stuff. And then there was a band that was very similar to ourselves that were playing Stones and Pretty Things and so forth. And I felt very inferior to them because of the standard of their performance. But after we got up and played, at the end of the evening, they invited us to their parties and they became almost like brothers. And every time we played up there, they would really welcome us into their circle. Likewise, the people that were coming to the dances would be coming to all these parties, to the point where at one stage we invited both of those bands down to Invercargill and they brought a busload of their audience down to share that evening with us and party at Ern Street afterwards. So the acceptance was pretty good, and here it was as well. We got quite a following.
Yeah, and those guys who we thought were accomplished musicians, I remember the Chris Betts and Pete Fraser and Pete Edmonds and that coming up and saying how great they thought we were. And I mean, that was totally unexpected to me.
Yes,
The
yeah.
bands in Invercargill did not ever come up to me and say that was fantastic, man. But in Dunedin, you know, once we got up there and I was hearing those bands that were more to my liking and they were actually coming up, introducing themselves and going, you guys are fantastic. It helped you sort of go, gee, we're okay after all, you know, this sort of thing.
While we're on the topic of Dunedin, just tell me about the Cellar Club. What was, just briefly, maybe Barry, you can, what was the Cellar Club and what was it like? And you can all join in. You can describe the Cellar Club, because
Well, it was just a hole
you
in
can
the...
start with the Cellar Club.
The Cellar Club, from my memory, which is not that great, it was just a hole in the wall with a flight of stairs that went down, and it wasn't that big a place, was it? And it had a stage as you come down the bottom of the stairs, didn't it? It was just a good place to play in.
It was always packed.
Packed, yeah,
And it was always
packed.
exciting, you
Yeah.
know, and people were there for the music and having a really good time. And I mean, as a musician playing there, it was like, you know, there's lots of still photographs. Unfortunately, there's no footage, but you can see like people are just pushed right up to the front of the stage, and you couldn't give a bad performance there, I don't think, because they were so enthusiastic. And what was the guy's name? Roger Dixon,
Yes.
Owned it, and they had all these walls painted in, you know, the psychedelic fashions of the time,
Black
you know,
and white.
you know, and it was a great atmosphere. It was not dissimilar to the stage door in Christchurch, you know, the atmosphere, the fact it was a basement, and Dunedin was a jumping town. There was it was a university town, like it probably still is, and I think there was you know, it wasn't just the Cellar Club. We would go to the Cellar Club, we would play Sunset Strip run by this Eddie Chen, the Chinese entrepreneur, and then we would play these big gigs at the Agricultural Hall as well, which would have 3 or 4 bands on. They'd have 1,000 people, and you're like, Dunedin was a jumping town. I mean,
the Milky Way was another club. There were quite a few clubs up there we played
But the
at.
Cellar Club was the first one that we were invited to go to in Dunedin.
And we went there a few times.
A lot.
Yeah.
We ended up working there more than Invercargill in Dunedin, didn't we?
Yeah.
You used to go up, and a lot of the Angels would go up with you too, I understand, and there would be the Coffin Cheaters up in Dunedin.
Yes.
Can you tell me about that, Vaughan, and the others, about how you sort of go up and convoy you meet up here?
Well, sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes when we're up there, it would become known to the Coffin Cheaters, who were a Dunedin gang, that we would be playing, and a few of the Antarctic Angels would come up, and they'd come to the Cellar Club, and the deal was that they were welcome, but I think most of them sort of hung their jackets up as they came in and just mingled with the crowd, and there was never any animosity between most of the crowd. You would describe as sort of mods. The style of dress in Dunedin was very different from here. A lot of the guys, their hair was back combed, and they wore really bell-bottom pants and two-coloured shoes, and their fashion was quite really Carnaby Street, but they mixed in with the bikies as well. There was never any aggression. It was just generally a good time feeling, and at parties afterwards, a few of the bikies would come along as well, although...
Well, we'd get invited to their parties.
Yeah, we'd get invited to theirs. In fact, there was a party where the Coffin Cheaters were... Rocket decided he wanted to become a coffin cheater. He was a bit drunk, and in the process of his initiation, a few days later in Invercargill, he had to attend a doctor in Invercargill, and the doctor more or less asked him what he had been doing, and I won't go into any more detail.
Chris Brett from the Third Chapter's told me that when you guys came to town, although he was sort of your equivalent in Dunedin, he was taken aback by your appearance. He was really saying you guys seemed like sort of wild men coming up from the south, and I think you were hinting at that they were sort of more tidy and more fashionable mods, whereas you guys were coming up from Invercargill pretty, I don't know.
Yes.
Let's talk about that. I mean, how did audiences in Dunedin and Christchurch find you guys? How did you differ from bands that were further north?
I think our hair was longer.
Hair was
Like
longer.
our hair was a lot longer, and that for some reason was a statement. And it wasn't. Maybe it was longer because we had colder winters down here or something. I don't know. But our hair was definitely longer than, say, the Pill in the Third Chapter and all that. And I mean, it was compared to, say, you go to a 60s magazine and look at a picture of the Beatles and then look at a picture of the Pretty Things. You know, we had hair Pretty Thing length, didn't we?
Yeah.
And those guys had, you know, they were maybe, you know, I don't think it was. My mother came up with a great term once, you know. I was heading out and, you know, I had something on, and it just didn't look right, and I put some jacket on because it had a bit of a rip in it and something else. She looked out and shook her head and said, "Calculated ruffianism." You know, that was, maybe it was a bit calculated. I don't know. Or was it just how we were?
Although some of the Third Chapter as a band used to dress fairly similarly to us, you know, just jeans and T-shirts and things. The Pill used to dress a bit sharper. Our hair was longer, but I think in talking to Chris Brett, I lived in Dunedin a few years later and knew Chris, and the thing that really struck him was the fact that we knew where he lived and where he flattered, and he couldn't get over the fact that we would rock up at 9 o'clock in the morning after a gig the night before with bottles of vodka and bourbon and be sort of, having enjoyed a full night of party, be wanting to drag him out of bed early morning and party on. He couldn't
Or maybe
get his head around that, I think.
Or maybe that was the thing. I mean, it's not a bragging thing or an issue thing. I mean, God, Barry, what, 30 years since you've had a drink?
Oh, it's getting on, I can't recall.
I have 2 glasses of wine now, I go to sleep in the chair, but we were a hard drinking band. Like there was no, and there weren't amphetamines to fuel us. We would drink VAT 69 whiskey and stuff straight out of the bottle.
Yeah,
and maybe
green ginger wine.
you know, and I mean maybe, and I think from memory, you're right. When we went up and played with those other bands further north, I think they were a bit shocked.
Yeah.
Because they listened to the rules. You're not allowed to drink in the venues. We actually came fully equipped,
Yeah.
you know, for a big session
It was-
at the gigs.
It was almost, you know, if we can't drink, we won't play.
That's right.
And I can remember...
No
pla-
beer, no here.
And I can remember we played at the Sunset Strip one night, and Rocket brought his girlfriend up, and the manager, Eddie Chin, invited the girlfriend into his office, and as we were playing, the manager, who would probably be 50-year-old plus Chinese guy, mentioned to the girl, look, if you sleep with me, you'll never sleep with a white man again. She came out and told the guys in the band. Now, we were drinking red wine, heavy stuff, pinotage, flagons of it, and they had just refurbished this club, and the changing room, we absolutely demolished it. We tipped all the stuff around all the walls and just made an absolute pigsty out of it as a sort of a statement that you don't talk to a girlfriend of the member of our band like that. They're dirty old bastards.
Well,
so far as I
honourable
thought. Yeah.
gentlemen, weren't
Yeah.
we? So we trashed his club.
So that's something I can
I'd
remember
forgotten all about that.
alcohol and yeah.
Yeah, but no, yeah, that's what I think. You know, maybe, and I don't know whether that's where it even came from. The drinking thing. It just must have all just liked to drink when we started. We
Well-
didn't sit down and say this band will drink.
No, we were born into it. Well, my father was an alkie, so was my mother.
And you moved into my father's house, and he was an elkie
Yeah.
too.
And I think too that if you're drinking a lot and if you're fairly drunk and playing in a group, it doesn't take much to act as a catalyst to get you to do something stupid, because your logic's not there at that time. But fortunately, nobody ever really got hurt, and we didn't get into too much trouble.
And I guess we're nearly done, but I guess the drinking contributed to the nickname that people gave you. Can you tell me what the nickname was? The play on words from the Unknown Blues.
What, the wild and savage and all?
No, the unblown nose.
Oh, the unblown noses. I reckon that was Wombi.
I think Wombi might have
He
thought
might have
of
been
that.
just
Yeah.
pissed as a newt one night, and you know,
Yeah.
somebody asked him what band he played, and he goes, "The unblown noses." You know how Wombi goes. It was Wombi was a real trickster, a jokester, and I really think that term came
He had a weird
Yeah.
sense of humour.
from
I
him.
think.
Yeah.
I really believe that came from him, and then once people got a hang of it, it just sort of went out there. But that actually came from within the band.
Yes, yes.
It
Yeah, I
definitely
think so,
did.
yeah,
I reckon
yeah.
that was one, self-deprecating thing. You know, like saying, "Well, you can't hang shit on us because we're hanging it on ourselves,"
Yeah,
kind
yeah,
of
yeah,
thing.
yeah.
And that, Wombi contributed a lot of humour and fun to the band in that way.
Yeah, right,
didn't he?
Yes, yeah.
In fact, cuttingly so.
Shame,
Sometimes.
shame he wasn't here today.
It is a shame Wombi's not here, but he's alive, so maybe next time.
Okay, I'll just pause there. Well, let's start. Let's go right back to the beginning. What was that? It's a really loud hum.
Yep, that's the fridge.
Okay. Let's start at the beginning. I know we've covered it a little bit, but Dave, perhaps you could start by telling me how the Unknown Blues got started.